Roy Kessler slapped a yellow notice on my door on a Tuesday morning. $40. A late utility reimbursement 3 days overdue, and he wanted it framed like I'd robbed the man blind. I stood there in my socks reading it twice, coffee going cold in my hand, thinking, this is the hill he wants to die on? $40? Seriously, dude? He'd knocked loud, too, like this was some kind of emergency. Like a delinquent $40 justified pounding on somebody's door at 8 a.m. on their day off. I remember standing there thinking the guy had absolutely no sense of scale. Stick around. This gets a whole lot bigger before it's over. Because Roy Kessler had no clue, none, that the building he'd been bullying tenants in for 6 years didn't actually belong to the man who signed his paycheck anymore. It belonged to me. I'm Tasha. I work in property portfolio management for a real estate investment firm downtown. I read title deeds and LLC ownership structures for a living. Boring work most days. Spreadsheets, filing cabinets, county records. Nobody outside my industry ever wants to look at twice. Until the week it wasn't boring at all. The week I found my own address sitting inside a stack of documents I never expected to see. Let me back up. My grandmother Odessa passed 6 months before that yellow notice showed up. She'd spent 40 years building a quiet little real estate portfolio, 4 buildings total, all held under a family LLC nobody talked about at holidays. She wasn't flashy about money. Ever. She drove the same car for 18 years, clipped coupons out of habit, not need. You'd never guess sitting across from her at Sunday dinner that the woman passing you cornbread owned real property scattered across 3 neighborhoods. I got named executor. That meant I had to go through everything: deeds, leases, tax filings, the whole mess. Boxes of paper in her hall closet nobody had touched in years. I spent most evenings that month sitting on her living room floor sorting folders, missing her in that specific quiet way where every single document feels like it's got her handwriting on it somewhere. 2 weeks into that mess, I found a purchase agreement dated 18 months before she died. A 4-unit building on Marchetti Street. My building. The one I'd been renting in for 3 years, paying rent to a management company that answered to Roy Kessler, who I'd only ever met in person twice. I sat at my kitchen table holding that paperwork for a solid 10 minutes. My own grandmother had quietly bought the building I lived in. Never told me. Probably didn't even connect the dots. Odessa bought property the way other people bought lottery tickets. Steady and unremarkable. 4 or 5 deals a decade, never bragging about it. She probably just saw a listing on Marchetti, ran the numbers the way she always did, and closed the deal without ever once mentioning it to me over dinner. If you've ever found out something about someone you loved only after they were gone, you know exactly the specific kind of gut punch that is. Not sad exactly. Something closer to awe mixed with a little bit of grief you didn't know you still had room for. I called my mom that night, half expecting her to already know. She didn't. Went quiet on the phone for a second, then laughed. Said that sounded exactly like something Odessa would do. Build something enormous, and never once make it about herself. I didn't say anything to Roy. Not yet. Grief does something weird to your priorities. I had a funeral to plan, an estate to untangle, and a full-time job on top of it. The deed could wait. Roy Kessler apparently could not. That yellow notice was the first real crack in what I thought was just an annoying landlord situation. Here's the thing about Roy. He wasn't scary. He was petty. Big difference. Scary men make you nervous. Petty men make you tired. Roy liked writing people up, late fees, noise complaints that were really just him being nosy. He'd corner tenants in the hallway and lecture them about lease clauses like he'd personally drafted the Constitution. The man wore the same navy windbreaker every single day, rain or shine, like it was some kind of uniform that gave him authority. Carried a little clipboard around the building most mornings, jotting things down. Nobody ever saw what he actually wrote on it. I used to joke with Deja that it was probably just a grocery list dressed up to look official. She said it was probably his fantasy football lineup, and honestly, either one tracked. I'd watched him do it to my neighbor Deja 3 different times. Deja worked nights at a hospital. Roy once left her a note claiming her footsteps at 7 a.m., disturbed the tranquility of the building. Deja worked 12-hour shifts saving people's lives, and Roy was mad about her sneakers on carpet. She laughed about it at first. By the third note, she wasn't laughing anymore. That should have told me everything I needed to know about the guy. It didn't, not fully. Not yet. 2 days after the yellow notice, I paid the $40. Didn't argue. Didn't want the headache while I was still knee-deep in probate paperwork. Roy took the check without a word of thanks, just a little smirk like he'd won something. A week after that, Roy caught me in the lobby, unusually chatty for a man who mostly communicated through yellow paper. Asked how things were going, said he'd heard I'd lost a family member recently, hoped everything was getting settled. I said thanks, kept it short. Figured it was one of the rare moments he was trying to act human. Looking back, I don't think it was kindness at all. I think he was fishing. Somebody in that building had mentioned the funeral, and Roy wanted to know exactly how much settled meant, whether there was money coming, whether it was worth being a little nicer to me for a while. He asked almost too casually whether I'd be staying in the unit or moving on to bigger things soon. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it differently now. Here's the part where it should have ended. It didn't. 3 weeks later, Roy posted a notice in the lobby. Big block letters. Mandatory meeting, lease violations to be addressed. I figured it was about parking again. It wasn't about parking. Man really loved a good mandatory meeting, I'll give him that. The meeting happened in the cramped little common room on the first floor. Folding chairs set up in crooked rows, a table at the front where Roy had already laid out his papers before anybody else arrived. He liked being early to these things, liked setting the stage playing Landlord like it was a whole personality. I walked into that meeting and Roy stood up front like a man about to deliver a State of the Union address. He'd made a list. My name was on it. So was Deja's. So was an elderly man named Mr. Okafor who'd lived in that building longer than Roy had been alive. Roy read off violations one by one, voice pitched loud enough to carry like he wanted every single person in that room to feel the weight of being called out in front of their neighbors. Half of them were nothing. A bike in the hallway. A grill on a balcony that every single tenant had used for 2 summers without a single complaint until now. The whole thing had power trip written all over it, plain as day. When he got to my name, he said I'd created a disturbance by having friends over past 10 p.m., twice in 1 month. I hadn't had anyone over past 9 in 3 months. I said so calm right there in front of everyone. Not gonna lie, part of me wanted to laugh in his face. Roy didn't like that. His voice got that clipped official tone landlords use when they know they're on shaky ground but refuse to back down anyway. I have documentation, he said, tapping his clipboard, though he never once turned it around to actually show anybody what was written on it. He said if the pattern continued, he'd start the eviction process. For a bike, for a grill, for friends who apparently didn't exist. Mr. Okafor, 81 years old, stood up slow and asked Roy real quiet whether he understood what these people had actually been through this year, a hospital worker running herself ragged, a woman who'd just buried her grandmother. His voice didn't shake. It just carried the way a quiet voice sometimes does in a room that's already gone still. Roy said rules were rules, said he didn't run a charity. Somebody near the back muttered something under their breath. Roy ignored it. That's when I understood we weren't dealing with petty anymore. We were dealing with a man who liked having power over people who couldn't easily push back. And he had absolutely no idea how wrong he'd guessed about at least one of us in that room. I still didn't say anything that night. I went home, sat on my couch, and thought about my grandmother's handwriting on that purchase agreement. Steady. Patient. She never once raised her voice at anybody in her whole life, and she still ended up owning half the west side of this neighborhood by the time she passed. I decided I wanted to understand exactly what I was looking at before I said one word to Roy Kessler. So I did what I do at work every single day. I pulled the full ownership chain. Not just the deed, the property management contract too, the one linking Roy's company to my grandmother's LLC. Standard stuff, The kind of document trail I could pull in my sleep at this point, except this time my own name kept showing up in places it had no business being. What I found made my stomach turn in a whole different direction than grief ever had. Roy wasn't just being petty. Roy was skimming. The maintenance fund for that building money collected specifically for repairs, upkeep, emergencies hadn't been touched in 14 months. Meanwhile, 3 separate maintenance requests from tenants, including one from Mr. Okafor, about a broken radiator in the dead of winter, had gone unanswered. The fund showed withdrawals, regular ones, never labeled clearly, never matched to a single invoice from an actual contractor. 14 months of quiet, steady theft, dressed up in official-looking spreadsheets, while Roy handed out lease violation notices for grills and footsteps. I want you to sit with that for a second the way I had to. The man threatening an 81-year-old with eviction over a bike in a hallway was pocketing money meant to fix that man's radiator. I called a forensic accountant my firm keeps on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, guy named Warren Pelletier. Sharp, dry sense of humor, doesn't get rattled by anything. I sent him everything: the fund records, the invoices that didn't exist, 3 years of Roy's management statements. Took Warren 9 days to build a report that would hold up anywhere. 9 days of me going to work, coming home, nodding at Roy in the hallway like I didn't know a single thing, watching him post another petty notice about somebody's welcome mat being an inch over code. 9 days is a long time to keep a secret from a man who thinks he's the one holding all the power in a building. I remember passing him by the mailboxes one of those mornings, him tipping his chin at me the way he always did all business. No idea he was talking to his own boss's granddaughter. I built that final spreadsheet at 2 a.m. Colin asleep down the hall. No idea yet what his wife had been quietly assembling in the next room for the better part of a year. Part of me wanted to wake him up right then. I didn't. I wanted him seeing the finished picture, not a half-built theory that his own mother could still talk her way around. I sat with that number for a long time before I did anything else. $2.4 million is not an abstract number when it belongs to someone you've eaten dinner with 100 times. I sat at my own kitchen table that night doing the math over and over, half hoping I'd find an error somewhere that would make the whole thing smaller, more explainable. I didn't find one. The number just stayed exactly that big no matter how many times I ran it. I finally told Colin everything on a Tuesday night, laid it all out on our kitchen table, the way I'd lay out findings for any client. The property records, the trust documents, the consulting fee payments routed straight back to his own mother. $2.4 million gone. For a long moment, Colin just stared at the papers, not saying a word. Then he asked me, voice tight, how long I'd known. About a year properly. Suspected something longer than that. He asked why I didn't tell him sooner. I told him the truth. I needed it airtight before I brought it to a family that would close ranks the second they smelled an accusation coming. He didn't argue with that. He just sat there a long moment, looking at his own mother's name on document after document, watching 6 years of family Thanksgivings rearrange themselves into something a whole lot uglier. He asked me one more question before either of us said anything else that night. Whether I'd ever doubted him too, wondered if he was in on it somehow. All those years I sat there gathering evidence in silence. I told him honestly no, not once. Colin's the one person in that entire family who never once made me feel like the quiet outsider. That's exactly why I protected him from carrying this alone for as long as I possibly could. Here's the twist inside the twist, though, because this story wasn't done cracking open yet. Walter, it turned out, wasn't nearly as far gone as Denise had been telling everybody. I requested his full medical records with Colin's help this time, both of us moving together now, instead of me working alone in the dark. Walter's actual cognitive evaluations from the past 3 years showed mild impairment. Mild. Not the barely knows his own name picture Denise had painted to justify sole control over every dollar he had. I want you to sit with that for a second, too. She hadn't just been stealing quietly. She'd been exaggerating his condition to everyone around her, to doctors, to family, to herself, probably because a more confused Walter was a Walter who couldn't push back. Walter had been quietly aware on some level that something felt wrong. He just didn't have the financial literacy left to prove it. and every single person he might have asked for help was the exact same person benefiting from him staying confused. Colin and I went to see Walter together. No warning, no Denise in the room. We laid out what we'd found, gently giving him every chance to process it at his own pace. Walter went quiet for a long moment. Then he asked us one simple question. Was Denise stealing from him? There's no soft way to answer that question. We told him the truth. Something in Walter's face did something I wasn't expecting. Not shock, exactly. More like a lifetime of small doubts finally getting confirmed all at once. He said he'd noticed money feeling tighter than it should notice Denise getting cagey whenever he asked direct questions, and had told himself over and over that he was just confused, that his own daughter would never. He got real quiet after that, staring out the window of his own living room for a long stretch neither Colin nor I interrupted. When he finally spoke again, he asked whether we thought Denise had planned this from the very beginning, or whether it had just crept up on her one small decision at a time. I told him honestly, I didn't know. In 11 years of this work, I've learned most people don't wake up one morning deciding to become a thief. They just keep making the slightly easier choice over and over until one day the easier choice has a number attached that's too big to walk back from. We filed a formal report with Adult Protective Services the following week, alongside a civil suit to recover the missing funds with an elder law attorney I'd worked cases alongside before. I finally got to use 11 years of professional experience on the one case that mattered more to me than any client file ever had. Every case I'd worked before this one belonged to a stranger. I did good work for them, real work that mattered. But there's a difference between doing your job well and doing your job for somebody who calls you his favorite lawyer over Sunday breakfast, even after you've corrected him 6 times. This one finally was personal in the best possible way that word can mean. Denise found out I was the one who'd built the case against her at a family meeting none of us wanted to have. For one long moment, something in her face just came apart completely. No defense ready, no smooth explanation. She said she'd only ever meant to protect the family's assets from outsiders, that she'd always planned to sort it out properly eventually, that she never thought of it as stealing, just managing. Her hands were shaking around a coffee mug she never drank from the whole meeting, knuckles pale against the ceramic. I watched her search for a version of the story that made her the reasonable one, and watched her come up short every single time. Then, almost as fast, something harder crept back into her voice. She looked straight at me and said, "The quiet ones always think they're so clever, don't they?" I told her the quiet ones just pay attention. That's all it ever takes. The civil case settled 8 months later. Denise and Bianca were ordered to return just over $2 million to Walter's estate, along with losing all trustee authority, permanently replaced by an independent fiduciary the court appointed. Walter's actual care plan got rebuilt from scratch this time, with real oversight, real transparency, real people checking each other's work. The settlement hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes, almost anticlimactic after everything it took to get there. I remember sitting in that courtroom thinking about every single Thanksgiving I'd spent quietly watching this exact family, and how strange it felt to finally watch the math get corrected out loud in a room with a judge and a court reporter, and absolutely no green bean casserole in sight. Bianca tried defending her mother, at first insisting the family LLC was legitimate, that consulting fees were normal business practice. Then the forensic report on the actual work performed for those consulting fees came back. 0 documented hours, 0 deliverables, 0 anything except a bank transfer every quarter like clockwork. Bianca stopped defending anybody after that. She sat through the rest of that meeting staring at her own hands, and I watched something in her finally understand exactly how much of her adult life had been quietly funded by money that was never actually hers. Marcus cooperated with investigators once he understood exactly how much legal exposure he was sitting on himself. Turned over records, texts, and email trails showing he'd known more than he ever let on at that one barbecue where he first mentioned the trust. He called me afterward, actually, first time he'd reached out directly in years. Said he was sorry for staying quiet as long as he did that. He'd told himself it wasn't really his business how Denise handled things. I told him I understood that instinct better than he probably realized. Staying quiet was basically my whole strategy too for 6 straight years. The difference was what I did with the silence. Walter's still with us. Still sharp most days, though the toll of everything hit him harder than any of us wanted to admit at first. He moved in with Colin and me 11 months ago. Every morning he asks me the same question, half joking, now, half not. Whether the quiet accountant caught anybody stealing from him lately. I tell him the same thing every time. Not on my watch, old man. Not anymore. He started calling me his favorite lawyer even though I keep reminding him I'm an accountant, not an attorney. He waves that off every time, says the difference doesn't matter much to a man who spent 5 years getting robbed by people who were supposed to love him. Says what matters is I'm the one who finally noticed. Colin and his mother haven't spoken in almost a year. That part still stings some days, watching a family come apart, even when the coming apart was completely earned. I don't regret a single thing I did to get here. I just wish getting here hadn't cost quite this much. I think about those 6 years sometimes. 6 years of sitting quiet at that table, letting an entire family believe I was exactly who they decided I was the day we met. Turns out being underestimated is basically a superpower if you're patient enough to actually use it right. Every family's got somebody they've decided isn't worth watching closely. The quiet one, the one who doesn't push back at dinner, the one everybody assumes doesn't fully understand what's being said around them. Be careful who you decide that about. Sometimes, that's exactly the person quietly building a case against you, one boring public record at a time for 6 straight years, while you keep passing her the green beans. I still go to Hargrove family dinners, now smaller ones, just Colin and Walter and me most weeks. Walter insists on making his own coffee these days, says he trusts exactly 2 people to touch his finances anymore, and one of them is himself. The other one, he tells anybody who'll listen, is his favorite lawyer who isn't actually a lawyer. If you've ever let somebody underestimate you on purpose while you quietly built the case that finally proved them wrong, tell me about it in the comments. And if this one had you rooting for the quiet one the whole way through, send it to somebody who's ever been written off way too fast by people who should have known better.